Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be listening to a compilation of some true, scary stories. I hope you enjoy them. So without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. My roommate slash bestie and I decided to go on a cross-country road trip where we spent whatever savings we had doing whatever the heck we wanted for nearly 2 weeks. After finally returning home the next week, we found out that there was a huge storm brewing in the Gulf. Being dumb college kids, our parents made us evacuate with them. My dad worked at a local hospital in the suburbs, and everyone was required to go through the storm, but they were allowed to bring their families. My mom, dad, and I packed up and planned to stay at the hospital. The usual hurricane plan was to hold up for a few days until the storm blew over. This was different. The storm passed. Levees broke. Chaos ensued. We were terrified, sure, but we knew my parents' house was safe, as we had a pretty good view of the surrounding neighborhood from atop the hospital parking garage. Compared to other stories of horror, we lived like kings. The hospital ran on a generator, so we never lost power, and we were never without food and medicine. Crazy stuff ensued, of course. Dogs were rescued and operated on since doctors were kind of bored at this point. Parties were had. All the while, the surrounding city was decaying. When the waters went down, people were able to return home. My parents' home in Metairie was unharmed aside from small damages, but totally livable. My college house with my roommate had water up to my second-floor bedroom. I was able to salvage most of my things, but my friend lost everything. Turns out, a family must have held up there for a bit, as I found diapers, candles, car keys, etc. The only things looted from my home were essentials: soaps, towels, and blankets. The only jewelry stolen from all of my valuables was a metal cross, which I believe they may have needed, so that's totally cool. Turns out, my house was marked as having a dead body upstairs. Probably my room, and probably why my comforter was gone. After recovering a bit and moving in with my parents in the weeks after the storm, I began to make the most ridiculous, stupid money ever made, as restaurants were cash only. This did create a sort of screwed up lifestyle, but I cleaned up my act. My dad was working at the Windsor Court Hotel pre-storm, and when it hit, he and a selection of the staff were on the premises. They spent the bulk of the storm moving priceless pieces of art to locations to keep them safe from any potential damage to exterior walls and the resulting exposure. He said the first night after the storm had passed, he went up to one of the higher floors and looked out. He says it like this: "Man, it was crazy seeing the city like that. No lights, but an occasional beam from a flashlight or something like that, and quiet. No cars, no music, no people, just the occasional gunshot and someone hollering. It was just big and dark and gothic, like a Batman movie." He said that it was unreal to see, but he realized the wheels had come off when he was looking out a ground floor window at a Subway restaurant across the street, and a man threw a trash can through the front window, and then a moment later he set the store on fire. The arsonist then screamed and ran through the street like it was the best thing ever. My dad then went on to say, "It was right there. I was thinking, oh boy, what's stopping this guy from killing me?" The National Guard came by not too long after. He told the staff that they were all going ASAP. He said they drove out in a line of cars like elephants walking through a dark forest with trunks holding tails. And once he got out of the city, he drove up to Baton Rouge where I live. He was shell-shocked for a few weeks thereafter. I was a new kid in the USA for the first time, and we settled in New Orleans from the jungles of Borneo about 3 years prior to the hurricane. As there aren't many natural disasters in Borneo, we were pretty freaked out by hurricanes, so moved away every time something came close. When the hurricane hit, I was around 10 years old enough to know what it is and how serious everything was, yet not yet old enough to really understand. Basically, I saw the whole thing as a big adventure, where I got a week off school. I only really grasped the loss and devastation to the whole community years later, upon reflection. Anyways, about a week prior to the hurricane, my dad was thinking, oh no, not another one, because we have been there for a few years. The only difference was that the projected path for Katrina was headed straight for us, but usually it turns last minute. 3 or 4 days prior was when people started worrying, and I remember Dad said to me that this one was going to be a bit more serious than the rest. Mom was not in the US at the time, so just me and Dad. When the city ordered a mandatory evacuation, Dad was like, yep, pack your things, let's go. I remember putting all of my favorite toys on the top shelves and leaving the old ones closer to the bottom, just in case of flooding. I put most other things on my bed and took a collection of 20 stuffed animals, which I insisted I need with me in the car. I don't know what Dad was thinking, but he kept telling me this was serious, but ended up leaving really important documents, such as the passport, his master's diploma, etc., in the house. Anyways, with my treasure secured, I loaded everything into the car and prepared for the 6-hour drive to Houston. We had a family friend in Houston, which we could go and live with. At the time, we also knew several other families in the area from the church we went to, so we called them up and were going to leave for Houston together. Everywhere we went, everyone would have their TVs set to the news or the weather station. There would be constant updates on the wind speeds of Katrina and path projections, etc. So there was supposed to be 5 families, which left together, but when 3 of us grouped, the other 2 called and said they needed more time packing. At this time, we hear that the freeways are getting pretty packed, so our 3 families decide to leave first. Cue long and boring drive, lots of traffic and endless road. What usually takes 6 hours to drive took us 8. Luckily, we had enough gas, food, and water and everything, and made it to Houston after a long day drive. We were one of the first among our friends to make it there. After we arrived in Houston, the family friends showed us where we would stay, and the adults congregated downstairs to watch more news weather. Us kids actually set up board games upstairs. There were around 7 to 8 of us then, and had lots of fun, so time passed pretty quickly. After almost half a day, we see another family arrive. They left an hour after we did, and apparently took 10+ hours to drive from New Orleans due to the traffic buildup. The last family arrived middle of next day. Turns out the roads were closed and they had to detour north. Their overall journey took 20+ hours, and they left around 2 or 3 hours after we did. In total, there were between 30 to 50 people living in the same house, including children. So for the next week, we kids sort of enjoyed an extended sleepover where we would actually do lots of fun things in Houston City. We went ice skating, went to a park, and also I remember jumping on this huge trampoline. I think this was necessary for the adults to de-stress, because otherwise they were all just downstairs watching the news. After a few days, Dad told me that the hurricane hit New Orleans, and then the atmosphere calmed a bit. I remember that we kept checking Google Maps satellite view because we wanted to know whether our house was still there or not. It looked the same for a few days, but after about a week, we saw that the huge tree in our backyard fell onto a part of the house, so there would be some damage, but otherwise it was still there. After 1 week, we heard that New Orleans was struck pretty bad,
and were told that we could not go back. Even just to take our stuff, we'd have to wait until the area is secure. Dad and most of the other families decide to move out and find apartments in Houston and enroll me in a school. After 1 month, Dad leaves for a few days with all his friends to New Orleans. By this time, Mom flies back to the US to take care of me. Dad did not want me to go because it was still pretty dangerous due to the looting, and I did not want to get an injection anyways, so I stayed home. He left for the day and came home later with lots of stuff, including his documents. He told me that our house was pretty all right. We had 4 inches of flooding, but there was moss and mold everywhere. I learned that while our house was good, one of the families we lived with had lost their whole house with more than 9 feet of flooding. While all the other families came back with stuff, their car was empty. Other than that, another family which just moved to the US was also having a bad time because they did not have time to buy insurance before the hurricane. While they had minimal flooding, because they were so inexperienced with hurricanes, they actually thought it would be like a day trip and went to stock up their fridge before, and when they went back, the house stank. Anyways, we got along for the next few months in Houston. Parents sorted out all the insurance and everything, while I just focused on school. I remember being quite amazed at how friendly all the adults were to me. I got free meals, some senior citizens club knitted blankets for us, and there was just lots of support. After a few months of school, we had a break where we went back to New Orleans to stay at a friend's place for a week. They were away, and we helped them look after the house. We visited all the places we used to go, and saw basically the aftermath of the hurricane. My old school was completely flooded over, and many of the house's restaurants were destroyed and/or closed. While lots of repairs had already started, you can still see parts of the city which were like ghost towns. About a week into staying at the house, we came back to the house to find a tank blocking the street. We were confused, and some police officers just told us we had to turn back and find someplace else to stay that night. We went to live within another friend's house and kept looking at the news wondering what happened. Only the next morning did we hear that the direct neighbor was a veteran who had mental issues and apparently holed himself in his house and started shooting randomly. We heard that he had run out of medication and just went crazy. When we went back the following morning, we saw blast marks around the outer walls of his house and broken windows, etc. The door to our friend's house was opened, and some of the furniture had been rearranged, so we guessed that the police/military used it in some way. Mostly it was the furniture near the windows facing the neighbor. This specific incident for me highlighted how different New Orleans was now, and also the difference between it and Houston straight after the hurricane. After 1 year, we left the United States because Dad was posted elsewhere. Only late last year did we visit New Orleans again. We met many of the neighbors which we did not see for 8 years, and saw that the city was doing really well in terms of rebuilding. The parts which we visited were as they were before the hurricane, and I got to visit my old school and the library which I used to hang out. Overall, even though I did not really understand the hurricane, it did really show me how impermanent life can be. While I believe we were very fortunate compared to most, it did force me to grow up a bit. At the same time, the experience showed me how amazing some people can be, and how even very simple things such as a blanket during the ordeal could make it all seem much better. I still have that blanket with me, and am using it while I type. That's my story. Hope I didn't bore y'all too much. Thanks for reading.
This is something I've never really talked about before. I was living on the West Bank at the time and worked on Chupatopolis Street as a line cook. I was sent home that morning and remember thinking this is just another hurricane scare. No big deal. My mother was a nurse on the West Bank. We decided it would be best to stay at the hospital to weather out Katrina. I don't remember much from the hurricane, but the week that followed was one of the most formative experiences for myself, and certainly made me more appreciative of the relative normality that I enjoy day to day. Help was extremely slow coming, I was volunteering around the hospital as the staff dwindled to a skeleton crew. Nurses, medical doctors, aides all left to be with their families and check on their homes, but none of them returned. No police presence whatsoever. At night, I would go up to the roof and watch the fires burning out of control across the river. We were the only functional medical facility in New Orleans proper. Some patients requiring life support made their way to us early on. Our hospital was the last one with electricity. People were walking across the bridge from the devastated East Bank, attracted to the light of our building. I remember staff turning people away, back into the pitch-black city because we couldn't take anyone else in. They looked like the real Walking Dead. We heard reports of savage R-wording and murders happening in the Superdome and Convention Center. It sounded like the bowels of hell to me. The manager of a Walmart gave one of the hospital admins the key to the store so that we could freely loot it. I remember really respecting him and wondered if it was Walmart policy or if he was just being a good human. I helped put a man in a body bag. A friend of mine drove in Rambo style from Baton Rouge to get me out. Jacked up truck, AR-15, tactical this and that. The whole prepper package. I stayed with him for a few days before getting a ticket to Philly. I left Louisiana to never return. But overall, I had it pretty easy compared to the other hellish stories that I hear. I've lived in Houma all of my life. My family had stayed through Andrew when I was younger. I figured Katrina was just going to be another storm. A few years later, Ivan was supposed to go up the mouth of the river, but returned at the last minute. I figured this would be no different. The Sunday before, I was in the Superdome for the preseason game against the Ravens. I remember seeing Bob Brett, local meteorologist, on the big screen with the storm on the radar in the background. Everyone booed. I remember driving home having this odd feeling. When it became evident that it wasn't going to turn, I packed up and headed a little north. Everyone else I knew had evacuated. I had heard horror stories of 16 to 20 hours to get to Houston. I decided to go to my mother's about an hour north in Donaldsonville, west to southwest of New Orleans. The storm was intense. The neighbor lost their roof. My mother lost multiple trees, one nearly falling through the center of the house that we were in. My truck, parked near her front door to protect her home from any damage, would slightly lift off the ground and move a little with the wind. The noise was like a constant freight train for hours. This was one of the only times in my life I've actually been afraid for my life. After the storm, we spent the next few days clearing out my mother's backyard. You couldn't walk through it with all the fallen trees. On the third day, I figured if I was going to be hot and nasty, no power or cold showers, I might as well be hot and nasty in my own home. On the drive home, I started to realize the gravity of what had just happened. I was far enough inland that flooding wasn't a problem, but the wind had caused mayhem. I had to drive around 100-year-old oaks thrown across the highway. Power lines were folded like toothpicks. We listened to the radio, and we had heard about the New Orleans being flooded, but we didn't get it. Friends who had evacuated had told us about the flooding, and we were, yeah, water, no big deal. When I finally got home, I turned on the generator, flipped on the TV, and it really sunk in. People on roofs, their homes like islands in a sea. They were already trying to repair the levees, but the damage was clear. New Orleans looked like a total loss. I didn't think it would ever recover. All of the towns south of us had flooded out, with families losing everything. Houma had fared pretty well. minus the wind damage to a few brick storefronts. We dealt with no power for about a week before things started to go back to normal for us. A couple weeks after the storm, I drove through New Orleans on the way to Florida, and I will never forget the landscape. The fact that New Orleans has recovered as well as it has is a testament to the resiliency of its residents. My story happened on my 50th birthday. My wife and sons asked what I wanted to do for my birthday. My expected answer was a weekend on Long Beach Island, New Jersey. The town of Beach Haven is where my favorite hotel is. It was June 7th, 2012. It was a beautiful beach day, so the four of us walked to the beach to set up our things for the day. As the day goes on the west side of the island, we could all see a dark gray weather front approaching the area. We've seen this kind of weather many times over the years. As the front approached, we could see far west to the mainland on New Jersey, which was clear and beautifully blue. So we figured the front would be around 15 minutes as it passes. As the front was over us, it started to lightly rain. My wife and I tucked in under an umbrella, and my sons continued playing catch. The rain continued, and then it started to get windy, so I brought the umbrella down to block the wind. My wife and I were dry and blocked from the wind. We were happy knowing this will be over in minutes. Well, no warning, no area thunder. A bolt of lightning blinded us like a flashbulb, hitting the umbrella I was holding, and sizzle boom I call it. I felt the lightning travel through my left arm into my chest, and then out of my feet into the sand. I yelled some choice words. My wife and I were talking and moving my arms and legs, so I looked okay. About 15 seconds went by, and again, boom, another bolt hit down the beach about 100 feet away from us. Panic set in, so we all ran off the beach, left everything behind except for car keys, jumped in the van and drove back to the hotel. I had a very large glass of vodka and couldn't believe what had happened. When I finished my drink, we all went back to our beach spot, and our phones and my wallet were still there. The sun came back out. I was sore for a few days, and now I have a new respect for thunderstorms. Happy birthday to me.
In 2010, I had a day that changed my life forever. My wife and I took our boat offshore to the east side of Cape Lookout, NC, where we always had great fishing catches. That day, we went to the Atlas tanker wreck east of the shoals off the Cape, and then to my favorite hard bottom offshore of Chicken Rock. Our first drop, we both caught huge groupers that had their heads out one end and tails out the other of our 151 quart cooler. The next drop resulted in 2 more the same size, completing our limits. It was time to go home. The day was so calm I had rolled up the curtains on our T-top so we could move faster. As soon as we got close enough to see the lighthouse, I saw a sight that chilled my blood. A front had moved in, and a purple-black storm cloud stretched as far north up the beach as far as we could see, and ran a solid, deadly line south, disappearing in the rain that fell from it in torrents. Orange bolts of lightning danced down its entire ugly face. Uglier still was the massive waterspout sitting on the offshore sandbar that formed the southern side of the slough, where we would need to cross the shoals to get home. By now, the wind had picked up to more than 40 knots. The seas were a wind-whipped nightmare. My wife held the bow, and I fought my way to the locker under the bow cap, and got us life jackets that we helped each other into as the temperature crashed and we were engulfed by pelting torrents of hail. Somehow I managed to drop my front curtain, providing limited shelter from the blasting hail, rain and sand being sucked from the bottom. As I attempted to jog to my right to get around it, I saw a smaller twister directly in my path, cutting off our escape. The next moments were a blur, as I prayed that my wife would survive. The swirling wall of wind-fueled ice blew the big old hull on its side, and I felt a super hot flash and was momentarily blinded. Suddenly we were through the worst of it, and I regained my control of the steering, and using my GPS plotter, followed my outgoing track across Cape Point. It was still pouring buckets of icy cold rain, mixed with hail nut. We were through the worst of it. Standing in a freezing slurry of several inches of accumulated hail, still getting blasted by more, I managed to get our side curtains down and resumed our course down Shackleford, with lightning crashing all around us. With a couple of miles to go back to Rough Point at the entrance to Beaufort Inlet, I made a hard right turn, causing my wife to ask where the heck I was going. "I'm getting close enough to see the beach," I replied, "because if another one of those things gets us, I'm driving us on the beach and we're going to run for it." As we got to the inlet, the front cleared the coast, and it turned into a bluebird clear day. It wasn't long before I had the boat on the trailer, and we were in the warmth of the truck heading home. As I dried out, I started to smell singed hair. Looking down, I noticed the burns on my left arm, and a second burn on my left shin, a couple of inches above my ankle. Looking at my face in the rearview mirror, I gasped and pulled over, because the singed hair and red flash burns over the left side of my face told me what the hot flash I'd felt during the water spout had been. My wife is an RN, with all the cardio qualifications, so I felt confident when I asked her if I should stop at the hospital to get checked out. I decided to go on home because my heart was fine, and they'd probably keep me overnight for observation, and they don't serve beer. It's a good sea story now, but it was the last trip I took on my boat. The beginning of changes I could never foresee.
I still have PTSD, or at least a deeper understanding of folks that do. I was trying to seek shelter in the shark encounter outside viewing area at a theme park because it had a large cover, but was denied. So I went to stand under the shark feeder that happened to be next to the flagpole. Lightning struck the flagpole and then me. It came in through my left hand and exited out of my right foot. I was taken to a hospital in Orlando, Florida. I was 24 years old and a mom studying to become a nurse when I was struck. I've suffered long-term issues, including chronic severe pain, swelling in my lower extremities, heart problems, severe headaches, and fatigue. I don't know what life has in store for me, but it's 7 years later, and I'm still in horrendous pain, and doctors have no idea how to help me. I was on my way back from volunteering at a festival in Denmark when the weather turned wild. My friend, who's frightened of thunderstorms with reason, apparently experienced my ignorance. You never get struck by lightning. I got off the train in the middle of Copenhagen and considered myself quite safe considering that taller buildings were surrounding me and that it's a rare phenomenon to get in a large city. So I went to unlock my bike to start my journey home, not knowing that the second I stood up against the pylon my bike was locked against, the lightning would strike into the pylon. I experienced conduction, with the lightning traveling through the pylon, my bike, and then me. The seconds seemed like forever, and all I remember clearly is myself screaming very loudly, a power going through me, and being surrounded by intense white and purple colors, as if you were traveling in a spaceship faster that light. That's how crazy the colors looked. I didn't faint. Luckily, otherwise, my heart most likely would have stopped, or I would have experienced heart problems.
The shock you experience when something so unreal happens to you is indescribable, and you're overwhelmed with sadness, ridiculousness, confusion, laughter, and luck. I called the ambulance myself when my arm started to tingle, spasm, and tense up in unreal ways, also seeing as I thought it would be safer to get checked by medical experts. A fast trip to the hospital turned into an overnight stay with long needles and company consisting of elderly folk being positive about their heart problems. They did not expect a 19-year-old girl as a roommate for the night. That was sure. I was released with the comment that nothing is wrong, but you might experience some psychological trauma. I experienced way more than that. It may have been because of the psychological trauma, but no doctors in Denmark had knowledge of what exactly the symptoms are from getting struck by lightning. No one really knows how to deal with it. This was the biggest realization for me. It was not as normal as having PTSD from a car accident or other trauma. It runs deeper because you start to question the health of yourself. At first, I thought everything was fine. Of course, my muscles and nerves were more tense than ever, but I was in school, stressed, and carried heavy books every day, a more reasonable cause than your safety system still alarming yourself. I went to physical therapists, acupuncture, psychologists, chiropractor, and spoke up about my feelings and symptoms, yet nothing seemed to help permanently. Thinking back, I realized I've been way more affected than I thought so. I've experienced what I realize may have been a slight depression, had a personality change from extroverted to closing myself off from others. I've struggled sleeping and felt like I was fainting, fatigue not being uncommon by now. I'd never really experienced headaches before, and now they occur more often than pleasant, not knowing if it's because of the muscles tensing up or because there's actually something wrong. The uncertainty makes you go into a spiral of anxiety where you overthink whether the tingling in your legs, arms, and fingers come from something way more critical than just muscle tension. Your heart beats fast and suddenly goes faster. You think you're suffering from a heart attack or high blood pressure. It all blends together, and you experience an unusual anxiety attack where you still function, but with less concentration, more introverted, and more tired. Your body working on extra high alert exhausts you in a way only people with experience can imagine. The incident changed me, and it's debatable whether it was for the better or worse. You are forced to look into yourself and question the actions of your body, but it also limits you to do things you would have been able to do before. Getting struck by lightning is such a rare incident that no one really knows how to act around you when you experience changes, and medical experts have such little knowledge about the symptoms that they have a hard time guiding you. I'm sure other victims of electrical shocks and lightning shocks will have had similar experiences.
A few months ago here in Houston, Texas, I was indirectly hit by lightning. I was standing at my back door, inside. The door was closed, but my hand was on the metal door frame when I was hit. I went to the emergency room via ambulance and didn't have burns, just bruises and chest pain, and weakness on the right side of my body, which the jolt went through. I was released after being admitted for about 13 hours, and was told that I might have some late side effects, but never told what that would be. I've noticed the past few weeks that I get random brain fog and memory loss. Like yesterday, I forgot the name of a song that I had just learned how to play and how to actually play it. My husband had to show me a video of myself playing it in order for me to remember. Things like this keep happening. I was supposed to follow up with a neurologist, but with no insurance and over $30,000 in medical bills, I can't even afford to pay. It's just not feasible. I was hit by lightning while playing in my backyard with bow and arrows shooting targets. I was holding arrows in my hand with metal tips near my ear, bending over to pick up more arrows when lightning hit me. I still have some hearing loss and ringing in my ears. My story falls under the category of ironic. It was my last day of living in Florida. I was in career transition, leaving the chief meteorologist post at WJKS in Jacksonville to become the weekend meteorologist at WEWS in Cleveland. It was a typical late summer Saturday afternoon. The cumulus towers were starting to build, and the thunderstorms would soon arrive. The moving vans had just departed, and we were putting the final touches on cleaning the house. My job? Vacuuming the living room. I heard the first clap of thunder, and then the downpour began. For those of you that have never experienced an afternoon thunderstorm in Florida, here's how they typically work. There's lightning and thunder, torrential rain, and occasional gusty winds, all which lasts about 5 to 10 minutes. Then the sun comes out. It's not really a cooling rain, it just makes things more humid. This particular thunderstorm would have been of no concern, but we had a screened-in back porch, and I had left one of the windows open, so the torrential downpour was now soaking the porch's indoor/outdoor carpet. So I shut off the vacuum, opened the sliding glass door, walked across, reached over and grabbed firmly onto the metal window frame to shut it. It was at that point that I looked and saw all the little hairs were standing up on my wrist. I thought to myself, now would be a good time to get out of here. The next thing I know, I'm on my back in the living room. My oldest son, who was about 2.5 at the time, was standing over my face. He said, "Daddy, that was funny. Do it again." Normally I'd laugh, but I couldn't talk. In fact, I was, in the immortal words of Led Zeppelin, dazed and confused. Just then, the door flew open, and my next-door neighbor ran in and asked if everyone was okay. He saw me on the floor and started to assess. He was a sheriff's officer. He started asking me a bunch of questions, and when I finally spoke, I asked, "What happened?" He said, "You must have been struck by lightning. I saw your house get hit. That's why I came over." I sat there for a few moments and finally declared, "There's no way that I just got struck by lightning. I'm a meteorologist." Yes, I really said that. Luckily, I survived. No major damage except for a burn on my back, where we surmised the lightning went up and out of me. The real irony? I was on the Duval County Board of Lightning Safety. I was lucky enough to pass along this story, and act it out, to a couple of thousand school classrooms over my 20-plus years on television. Every so often, I'll run into one of those students who is now all grown up. To a person, they all remember the lightning story and my lightning safety lessons. When you hear thunder, go inside. When you're inside, no baths or showers. Stay off of any cellular phones. And don't hang on to any metal window frames. My name is John. In 2013, when I was 16 years old, I was struck by lightning on Labor Day weekend at my lake house in Gainesville, Georgia. I coded for 4 minutes and 48 seconds. They thought that I was dead. Thank God I got struck while my buddies and I were playing football in a field. There was a doctor, pastor, and a nurse watching us play. There was storms going on that we ignored. When I was directly hit by lightning, the doctor ran out and immediately started CPR and chest compressions. After almost 5 minutes, they were able to revive me and get me to a hospital in time. At the hospital, they put me in a coma to protect my organs, and then transferred me to the doctor's hospital in Augusta, Georgia. where I was in a coma from August 31st to September 4th. They said that I would not be able to walk again, but I'm walking and jogging 2 months later. After one more surgery, I'm told that I will be back to 100% after the long recovery process. Then, I will be able to return to high school and my lacrosse team, but I won't be playing in thunderstorms anymore. I have an apartment in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, on top of a 5-story building. It is at the bottom of the major mountain pass and 5 blocks from the beach, so the warm air collides with the cold air from the mountains directly above my building. All summer there are epic storms in Vallarta, and I always seem to be in the heart of the storm, so I always go inside when they begin. I was in my bedroom, with both my front door and back door open. They line up perfectly, laying on my bed and trying to calm down my loving terrier body. He was shaking violently, and I had my hand on his head telling him not to worry. I will keep you safe. Seconds later, looking out my open bedroom door, I see a 4-5-foot stream tube of lightning flying through my apartment and splintering in all directions. It seemed like slow motion. The lightning entered into my spine, which was pressed against a wall and left 2 holes in my back, then went into my pet's head, which fried his hearing and vision. He is deaf and blind now. All of the electronics, as well as my refrigerator, phone, internet, etc., exploded or shorted out for good. Many of my Spanish clay roof tiles cracked and fell in. My neighbors on the lower floors rushed up to see what happened. I was in a state of semi-consciousness. My neighbors saw some smoke come out my back from the holes. It took about a week to clear my head, and then the huge changes in me began. I started to know so much, such as when I was being lied to. I could see who was a bad person and predict when things would happen. I would know what the truth was in most situations, even if I was not there. This changed my life dramatically. I dropped so many people out of my life. I had been incredibly social, happy, with hundreds of friends, and all of a sudden I knew who and what was real. I had no more desire to be very social. Many said it was depression or bipolar disorder. The lightning did cause me to have some nerve damage, resulting in a tremor in my hands, mostly my left, which is my dominant. This hand gets very bad when I am tired, and like many others, I now sleep less and have terrible insomnia. And I am far less patient. I was struck by lightning outside while working as a game warden in Millville, New Jersey. I was in the middle of a tree and my work truck that had a 6-foot aluminum ladder in the back. We were all hit. The tree looked like all the bark flew off where the lightning rolled around the tree. The truck's electronics were fried and I was found in the middle of the truck. I lost conscious for a few seconds, couldn't see anything, then flashes of light, and then my vision came back. I couldn't feel my limbs. I couldn't move them. It seemed like they were not part of my body. My heart rate was erratic, but a CAT test came back okay. I did a follow-up with the doctor. After complaining about my head still hurting, they found a golf ball-sized wound in the back of my head. I lost my career doing what I loved because I can no longer carry a gun. My whole life changed in an instant and will never be the same. I still suffer from the barometric pressure. My head gets heavy, and I don't have the ability to concentrate when there is a storm coming. I don't even watch the news because it just stresses me out, knowing I won't be able to get things done that I need to because of the storm. Resting my head helps, but nothing takes the annoying vibration sensation that goes on in my head. For the first 2 years, it was a long, slow recovery. I'm still not fully recovered. I lost my ability to talk right and walk without swaying or falling. I gave up at one point and just didn't get out of bed for 6 to 8 months.
It was just so hard that getting dressed was a huge chore to accomplish. I would constantly throw up or feel sick to my stomach if I moved, so I just chose not to move unless I had to. I had such severe migraines and dizziness every day, all day long. Nothing helped. I felt like that feeling you get when riding in an elevator and it stops. I had that all day. My vision got worse for 6 months. I got a new prescription, and my vision went back to normal.
A doctor diagnosed me as having something wrong with my eyes
And said he could help, but my insurance never approved the treatment. Still, if I move my eyes quickly, I get sick to my stomach. I can only drive on days where it's not that bad. I don't trust myself otherwise.
I'm a lot slower than I once was. I walk slower, talk slower, and think slower.
I used to be pretty fast-paced. My family and friends say that I'm more normal speed now. It doesn't make me feel better though, because when you are used to being one way your whole life, then it drastically changes in an instant. It's hard to cope.
I know I could be a lot worse, and I'm thankful that I came as far as I did.
I try to deal with what I have and make the best of every day, because you never know when your time is up.
Everything happens for a reason.
And I'm trying to figure that out and do the best that I can with what I have. My whole life I used to sit on my porch and watch the storms with my dad. I loved to see Mother Nature's dark, stormy sky roll into my backyard. I still like storms. Not as much as I did due to the complications I get from the weather changing, but they are still beautiful. I definitely have a new respect for storms and an understanding to stay safe.
On Saturday, July 14th, 2012, in Belfair, Washington,
I was in an open field setting up the sound system for an outdoor event. There was a lightning storm in the hills around us, but I didn't think anything about it. I don't remember the lightning strike or the loud thunder that soon followed, but I was later told that a lightning bolt struck 2 trees behind the facility, debarking one in a spiral pattern and split the other in half. It appears it then traveled through the ground to the transformer box, where the PA system I was working was hooked up. I was holding my iPod in my left hand, which was attached through a cord in the power amp. All of a sudden, I felt a horrendous shock go through the tips of my fingers and up my arm. Then my chest muscles felt like they were pulled out and snapped back like giant rubber bands, launching me out of my chair. When I came to, my left arm was burning like hot pins and needles, and my chest muscles were in spasms. My heart was beating fast and erratic. At first, I thought I was having a heart attack. When I came to, people were screaming, "We got hit." I only remember bits and pieces of the event afterwards. I remember holding my arm to my chest in pain and looking down at my right shoe and wondered why there was a hole in it. There wasn't one when I put it on earlier that day. Power and communications were blown out to the facility, and they had to run off emergency generators for the event. Later on in the day of the strike, I noticed a large bruise appeared on the front and the back of my left bicep muscle. It was not there before, so it's possible that the voltage went up my arm and maybe exited a little out of my bicep muscle front and back, then traveled into my chest. A friend looked at my shoe and said the voltage had to ground somehow, and it must have traveled down and exited out of my shoe, causing the hole. The next day, I felt like my heart was running a marathon, but I thought it was just an adrenaline rush. 2 days later, I woke up and drove to work feeling really disoriented. I reported the event to my supervisor and was told to fill out an electronic accident report. I couldn't figure out how to complete the form, so I contacted the safety officer. He said he heard about the lightning strike and offered to help me complete the accident report. After that, he drove me to the hospital to get checked out. The doctor told me I was very lucky to be alive. They mentioned and the full effects might not be evident for up to 10 or more days. The strangest things started to happen with my body. Before the strike, I was also dealing with severe back pain, but after the strike, I was virtually pain-free except for the pins and needles in my fingertips and spasms in my chest. No pain in my back or anywhere else. I remember first feeling like I was like a squirrel on a wheel because I couldn't slow my heart rate. After it slowed down, I experienced feelings of confusion. I got lost in my own house, and at times I didn't even know where I was or what I was supposed to do. I would start things and forget to finish. I had to relearn how to the simplest chores, like grocery shopping. I would be driving and not remember what exit to take or where I was at a given time. I was a master at multitasking, but for months afterwards, I had problems doing even one thing at a time. At work, I would sit and stare trying to remember what to do. As the days progressed, the fog started to clear. As my brain became clearer, the pain returned more intense than ever. I remember waking up 16 days later and I could hardly put on my shoes. I decided to go to urgent care. The doctor looked at my arm and referred me to an occupational therapist for treatment. The pain was debilitating. All I wanted to do was lay down and sleep. My energy level has since improved, but I still deal with chronic pain and depression. This experience changed my life, and I have a whole new respect for the power of lightning. If you can hear it,
Seek cover, and don't go near electrical appliances or devices. I live in the deadliest state for lightning, Florida. Unfortunately, I let a friend talk me out of using my better judgment one day. We were in Naples, Florida, enjoying a day at the beach. I saw the storm coming from the glades and told him several times that we needed to leave. Being from the northwest, he didn't believe me. Finally, the thunder was very close and we started to leave. A bolt struck in the grassy area beside us, and I was struck by a secondary finger. It ran through my body and out of my toe without leaving damage. 2 days later, I began feeling lethargy and a growing headache. A trip to the ER revealed a concussion. I definitely learned my lesson. Hello, my name is Jennifer. I live in Pensacola, Florida, and I was struck by lightning on June 21st, 2003. The weather was rainy. However, there was no thunder or lightning. My husband and 12-year-old son were outside on our covered patio when lightning and thunder hit at the same time, directly over our brick home. My husband said that the flash was bright, and the thunder sounded like a cannon going off. He hurried my son and himself into the house, only to find me at my stove with lightning running through my body and out of my front legs. I was on our phone when lightning entered through my left ear, traveled down my body, and out the front of my legs. The lightning formed a big orb around my legs and then dissipated into the floor. The phone was shot out of my hand and into the pot on the back burner of the stove. I had discoloration to both fronts of my lower leg area and bruising. However, no burns and only one blister. The phone ironically still works. However, the charge was drained out of it. My stove works. There were no burn marks found anywhere in or around the outside of the house. However, the garage door opener was fried. It hurt like heck. My joints were brittle and were going to break if I moved. However, I was able to communicate and move my body. My husband took me to the hospital, and on the way to the hospital I started twitching slightly and feeling cold from the inside out. I went into seizures approximately 30 minutes after the strike, and they lasted about 3 hours. I spent a couple of days in the hospital. I was left unable to walk on my own, but could move all of my muscles. My vision was blurry for weeks. Now I'm able to focus better. However, my eyes feel strained continually. Headaches and tremors are frequent. and thankfully decreasing in the intensity and frequency. Everything in my body was shaking for weeks, and I was cold continually. It took 6 weeks to feel warmth again in my body. I'm able to walk now and am in physical therapy 3 days a week. I have memory loss, vision problems, hypersensitive hearing, numbness, and all over weakness. I'm so thankful to be alive and know that I am blessed to still be here. A few years ago, a group of friends and I went camping together. The campground we wanted to go to was full, so we ended up camping deep into the forest, several miles away from any other campers. Well, the first night we woke up at about 2 a.m. to drumming and singing. It sounded like a traditional Native American type of song and music. I don't know how to describe it, but I got the feeling that something was very wrong. It was like the feeling you get when something bad happens. And the sound didn't sound like it was coming from anywhere in particular, but was just all around us. Anyway, we were completely freaked out and decided to sleep in our car. The next night, we decided to see if we could find any other campers near us that might have made the noise. We literally saw no sign of life anywhere around us, and we were in a somewhat clear part of the forest, so if anyone was camped near us, we would have seen them. We were still freaked out, but decided it was probably nothing, so we spent another night. That night, we woke up at the same time again to loud music, but it sounded closer this time. We also felt like something was wrong, and were extremely freaked out. We were too freaked out to go sleep, so we just stayed in our tent awake all night. The next day when we woke up, we decided to pack up and see if the other campground was open, and it was. When we stayed, nothing else happened. To this day, I really don't have an explanation for what that noise was. I don't understand how we could have not seen any other campers, and why they would have played music in the middle of the night. We also weren't on tribal land. My best friend, who was one of the other campers, is Navajo, and she said the music was similar to the music that she heard in tribal dances and rituals. I'm still freaked out about the whole ordeal, and it's hard to explain, but my body was just telling me that something was very wrong when this was happening. I had moved back to Georgia from Southern Oregon. Don't worry, I later returned to Oregon for a while. And the city life was a cultural shock after the peace and tranquility of the remote state of Jefferson. I decided that I needed to go out in the woods for some sanity. So on Valentine's Day, I went camping up outside of Helen in the Appalachian foothills by myself. I drive as far as I could up the dirt road, maybe 7 miles, until the rest of the road was closed off for winter. Nobody on the drive anywhere. Set up camp by the creek right there. Had a fire going, still daylight, and a truck pulled up out of nowhere on the road. 2 guys. I'm a female in my 30s, by the way. I hate to stereotype, but they looked like the Appalachian hillbilly part. They also had a bottle of liquor in their hand that they were drinking from. They asked why the road was closed. They peered around my campsite from inside of their truck. I'm sure noticing just one chair by the fire. I said that we are only staying for 1 night, and looked at the tent maybe to insinuate my man was in the tent. They left. They were creepy. It got dark and I got in my tent, and I kept thinking about those guys and I just could not shake it. I had no cell reception. I thought maybe I could sleep in my truck bed that had a camper on top. In case they came by, they would check the tent. But why would I put myself through that? So, I'm feeling defeated, because I just want some nature magic to soothe my soul. But I packed up my camp, put the embers out, and got on the road. No way would I have gotten to sleep.
I pulled out of the sight, and around the next corner, hours after I had seen them, they were there in their truck, just waiting in the dark. They pulled out in front of my truck after starting theirs quickly and started driving down the long, windy 7 miles. I had no reception. I was super scared, thinking of what I could do if they stopped. What if they ran their truck off the cliff? What if they had a gun? I made it to the main road and they took off, and I stayed in a hotel and told the hotel clerk to call the sheriff, and this was their license plate. I know that I probably narrowly escaped an R word or death or both. Happy Valentine's Day. Good thing I never celebrated. I'm back in Oregon, and very happy, by the way. You ain't gonna get me. Me and my friends, Mexican graphic design students, went to the Laguna Salada, Salty Lagoon, in Baja California, Mexico, to watch the Milky Way and shoot some star trails photography. The Laguna Salada is a vast patch of salt-encrusted land that was once a lake. It dried quite a bit ago, and you can actually find ancient bleached seashells if you check carefully. Anyways, we arrive at an entrance from the highway and drive around 500 meters deep into the Salada. We come to a nice spot with a lot of bushes at one side, while clear on the other. We thought this was perfect, as the bushes would block out the car headlights from the road. We stop and get out of the car. Then we all notice this strange, hissing, rattling sound all around us. Imagine being surrounded by invisible people playing maracas, some far, some closer. We are so puzzled and fascinated by the sound that we start to throw out theories about what it could be. A friend says it might be echo from the cars. Others says they're insects. And another one jokingly says, alien probes man, etc. With that put aside, we set up the tripod, camera, and shutter switch. We shoot some test shots, and after everything is right, we leave the camera with the lens open to shoot the star trails. We grab some lanterns and decide to go exploring. After walking about 15 minutes, one friend says, in a very fearful voice, 2 men are coming at us. We are like, yeah bro, nice try. But he repeats, not kidding, 2 men are coming at us and they got assault rifles. Almost instantly the 2 men yell, turn off the flashlights, turn of the flashlights now. And we're all like, he's right. We are scared and do as the men command. They get close and say, don't move, keep your hands down, don't do sudden movements. And then they start asking questions in a very aggressive tone. Who are you? What are you doing here? How old are you? What are your names? How long have you been here? Etc. After explaining ourselves, they start whispering to themselves while pointing their rifles at us. We are all frozen with fear, believing we were going to be executed right there for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. One of the men say, go back to your car and keep taking your photos, but do not go near that bush patch because, and I quote him, rifles tend to miss fire in there. As we are walking away from them, I was pretty sure we stumbled into a bunch of narcos doing some shady stuff there. I'm sure we are going to be sprayed from the back. I'm just walking slowly, as our flashlights are off, waiting for that hot lead to enter my back. You know how they say that your life flashes in front of you when you feel you're close to death? I can assure you it's not a lie. Past Christmas come to my mind. Me opening my sweet Super Nintendo, graduating from high school, past girlfriends, etc. I even start to get angry at life, telling myself, I'm gonna get killed by a bunch of scum narcos, all because of some photos. Thank God nothing happened. We get the message and decide to nope out of there. We decide to get out before we become another number in Mexico's narco wars. As we are all grabbing our stuff and packing up, we hear a loud rattling in the floor. A friend turns a flashlight, and turns out it is a baby rattlesnake, inches from my friend's feet, and in attack posture, with rattle shaking like crazy and all, ready to strike. We cannot believe how stupid we were. All the sounds we heard in the beginning turned out to be rattlesnakes. All around us. Narcos and rattlesnakes. We noped out of there and never came back. A few summers ago, me and a few buddies went catfishing at a local reservoir. This is rural Ohio, and the reservoir was off a dirt road about 2 miles from the village that it fed, which was a village of about 1,500 people. We had fished this spot tons of times, and we very rarely saw other people during the day, and we never saw anyone out there at night. So the day we went out, it was about 9 p.m., sun's going down. We had a couple of cases of beer. We were planning on staying out until the sun came back up. We didn't want to be bothered. We weren't really allowed to have alcohol around the reservoir anyways. So we actually drove a dirt service road clear around the reservoir, as far away as we could get from the road end. This service road was nothing but compacted dirt, with tree roots running across it, areas that had washed away during flooding, fallen trees in the road that had been there for years, etc. This place was not a well-traveled road, and the only way we got around it was that we all had lifted 4x4 trucks or jeeps. The site we pick is out on a piece of land that stretches out into the water a bit in a teardrop kind of shape. Goes maybe 20 feet out into the reservoir. So we have water on all sides of us besides our back. We figure we can fish from different directions. Since we will have 5 or 6 poles in the water, it would give us a little bit more room to cast without tangling lines. Plus, there was remnants of a fire pit and some wood that was already collected. So, we go to start a fire, bait our poles and start drinking. We fish for 2 or 3 hours and get good and drunk. In the meantime, a thick summer fog creeps in across the pond. Then we hear a huge kersploosh, and we see the ripples coming from across the water to our right. There's maybe 50 yards of water between us and the other bank, and the fog was so thick we could not see the bank or what caused the sound, but we could see the ripples in the water once they got to us. We explain it away to be a tree limb falling in the water, or maybe a beaver jumping off into the bank, and we keep fishing. About 20 minutes later, another huge kersploosh, and the ripples come again. And let me tell you, there was no mistaking the sound. It was not a fish flopping, and it was not a frog jumping in the water. It was the sound of a very large and heavy object, like the sound someone makes when they do a cannonball off the diving board. But we explained it away as we did with the first. Shortly after that, we run out of wood for the fire, so we leave one guy to watch the poles. Me and a few buddies go into the brush to find fallen sticks and whatnot. We all go our separate ways and meet back at the fire shortly after. One of my buddies comes back to the fire with a white jacket, a pair of rubber boots, and a clown mask in his arms. This was about the time when there were all the posts about the scary clowns who would lurk around towns to scare people. I knew that those stories were crap, so I figured it was just left over from some kids who had a party out there one night and left it. So we get the fire going again. We fish for a little while longer, when we hear twigs breaking in the woods across the water, and then another huge kersploosh. At this point, we know there is someone out there with us, and the sound has to be dropping something in the water. So we call out and we say, "Hey, if there's someone out there, we aren't making trouble, just fishing and drinking some beers. We'd be happy to have you join us." Dead silence. So we call out again to no response. A couple of my buddies are seriously freaking out at this point, between the booze, the clown mask, the fog, and the mystery noises. So I get that drunk courage. You know the kind. And I decide that we should all go walk around the bend and see what the heck's going on. This guy's being a butthole and trying to scare us. I convince 2 of my buddies to come with me, and the other 2 guys watch the poles, So we three trek into the bush with our flashlights, make our way through thick fog, start working around this lake. And as we go, we start finding bits of trash and saplings that have been cut down, and then more trash, and then footprints of someone in their bare feet, which is odd since it was so much work to get back to this spot on the lake. No one would be hiking around this far around the lake to fish in this spot. As I'm sweeping the woods with my flashlight, I walk over the crest of a hill, and not 10 feet in front of my face is a tent. This tent had been there for a long time. There was moss growing on the sides of it, and there was trash and stuff thrown all around this campsite. Most concerning, though, was the pile of propane tanks. There had to have been 15 or 20 of these 5-gallon propane tanks. So we all looked at each other and said, well, guess this is none of my business. And we hurriedly made our way back to the fire, threw all of our stuff in the back of the trucks, and made our way out of there in a hurry. On the way out from around the reservoir, we pulled onto the main, still dirt road and passed a crappy little Toyota Camry with 5 dudes in it. Watching in the rear view, they pull onto the service road that we just left out of. So for those that aren't savvy in rural southern Ohio, we busted a meth lab in the middle of the woods. The owner of said meth lab tried to scare us away by throwing stuff in the lake. I can only assume that when throwing stuff in the lake didn't scare us away, the meth cook called some of his buddies to come scare us out. Or worse yet, the meth cook called his buddies after we saw his operation. In which case, I'm glad that we got out of there before they showed up. I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week, I had to take a big group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge, where they had to build a shelter out of sticks, leaves, etc., and sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about a half a mile from the main camp, but we took them a circuitous route that made it seem really secluded. Anyways, on this one night, all the campers had made their shelters. We had cooked dinner, and we're all just sitting around the campfire. It was getting late, maybe 11 o'clock, so I sent all the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up the fire. That's when we heard in the distance what sounded like church bells. They were pretty faint, but myself and my fellow staffers could definitely hear them. They went on for about 30 minutes, ringing every 30 seconds or so. We were all a little creeped out, as there were no churches or towns within 20 miles of us. After the bells stopped, though, the singing started. It was too faint to hear the words, but it sounded like church choir music, but a lot of people and a lot more enthusiastic. Also, it was almost midnight at this point. The singing went on for well over an hour, sometimes quieting down until we almost couldn't hear it, sometimes getting so loud that we thought it was getting closer. All of the campers were super creeped out, but I lied to them, telling them that there was a church service going on in camp, and that there was nothing to be scared of. Eventually, at almost 1 a.m., the singing stopped. I found out a few days later that there had been a large KKK rally only a few miles away that night, and that is the singing that we heard. I grew up down a long dirt road in rural Alabama. My family owns a decent amount of land. I still miss the peacefulness sometimes, but I'm a gamer, so I need my high-speed internet. Anyway, the first time my friend and I decided to camp by ourselves, we were about 12 years old. We picked a spot in a field that was right at the edge of the woods. We really weren't that far from the house, maybe 500, 600 yards. Far enough to make us feel like we were being brave, but close enough to run back to the house if needed. Everything was going fine. We had a tiny fire and plenty of junk food to gorge ourselves with. It was probably around 10 or 11 that things took a turn for the worse. We were both just sitting and staring at the flames. There wasn't much noise that night because it was early winter, and the bugs had pretty much vacated by that time, so all we heard was the crackling of the fire and the occasional wind gust blowing what few dead leaves might have remained on the trees. That's when we heard it. I couldn't say exactly how far away the sound was, but it came from the woods. It was a blood-curdling scream. To this day, I've never heard anything in the wild that would make you as uneasy as that sound. We both looked at each other, and I know that we were thinking, run to the house, but we were tough kids, right? So we decided we'd lock ourselves in our tent and brave this new danger we'd discovered. Neither of us had any clue what that noise was, but we knew we weren't setting a foot outside the tent until the sun came up. My friend ended up actually falling asleep an hour or so later. I didn't have an easy time, though. I could see the dying light of the fire glimmering through the tent fabric. I just laid there watching the light dance until something disturbed it. It was like the fire went out completely, but then it came back, and I immediately realized something had walked between the fire and the tent. I covered my head with my sleeping bag, scared to death. I never heard a sound. No footsteps. Nothing ever messed with the food we left outside. 30 minutes later, I had to uncover my head because I was pouring sweat and about to suffocate myself. I could still see a tiny glow from what was left of the fire. I couldn't see or hear anything else. I laid there for probably another hour before I finally fell asleep. I woke to sunlight. My friend was already up and outside. We talked about the scream, and I told him what I'd seen after he fell asleep. We looked around and could see no tracks or any other signs that something else had been here besides us. It wasn't until years later and a couple of sightings from different people that we found out what actually made the sound. A panther.
I went on a camping retreat with a group of friends when I was just getting out of high school. We stayed at a campground that was made up of lots of cabins that had those metal bunk beds and a large main cabin with a kitchen and a socializing area. It was the first night up there, and I wanted to take a walk around the wood near the campgrounds. I walked along some trails until I could no longer see the lights from the cabins, and it was practically pitch black. After a little while, my night vision kicked in, and I continued my exploratory hike. After about 15 minutes of walking in the dark, I could see a shape ahead of me in the path. I stopped and tried to make out what was there. About 100 feet ahead of me was some small guy or kid standing in the middle of the path. He was standing completely still, and it appeared that he was standing in the middle of a bridge that the path led to. I stayed really quiet and started backing away while keeping my eye on him. It was way too dark for me to make out any details about him from where I was. All I could really see was that he was standing completely still. My nerve finally broke, and I hurried back to the campground. When I got back, I told my friends about what I just saw. And of course, a bunch of them wanted to head out to check out what I found. So, a bunch of us group up, and I lead them back to the bridge where I saw the guy standing. As we get closer to the spot, I could see that he was still standing in the same spot. We all kind of stopped and waited. We started whispering to one another about what we should do now. Some wanted to turn back around, and others want me to go over to him to see if he was okay. Being stupid, I agreed. I went ahead of the group and inched my way towards the figure. I was ready to bolt the moment something seemed wrong. So I got close, and when I got to the head of the bridge, I could see what the shape actually was. It was an upright vacuum. Someone had stuck an upright vacuum in the middle of a hiking path for some reason. I guess seeing something so foreign to the surroundings, along with it being completely black and white dark, made our imaginations go a bit wonky. Overall, this was pretty mundane, but the whole experience has stuck with me for decades. So me and 3 of my buddies, Andy, Kurt, and Morgan, were hiking the AT over summer break. We were only going to be out 3 to 4 days doing a section in Pennsylvania. On day 2, we were multiple miles into a state forest and multiple miles away from any roads or towns. As planned, we made it to a public shelter right around dinner time. It was a roof and 3 walls, with some wooden bunks built in. We were hustling to get there as some clouds had been rolling in. We pretty much drop our bags at the shelter and it starts to rain. It was a summer rain where it blows in and pours for about 30 minutes, and then blows away to reveal blue skies and sunshine. So we were glad to start building a fire and getting dinner ready. About 5 minutes after the rain had stopped, we hear someone coming down the trail, thinking, "Aw man, they must have got caught in the rain." However, first to round the trail is a happy little corgi, dry, with his feet barely wet. The corgi ran up to us as we all had our snacks out and started begging for food. Behind him came a middle-aged man, slowly moving down the trail. He was wearing blue jeans, a white t-shirt, cowboy boots, had no gear with him, and was also bone dry. At this point, we all start looking at each other, because none of this makes sense. We nervously play with the dog for a few minutes as the man takes his sweet time making his way over to the shelter. He walks up and says hello, and doesn't really engage in any conversation. Seems a bit socially awkward, and we were all too bugged out to try and ask him questions. He came within about 10 feet of us and was just walking around and seemed to be enjoying the scenery. We all looked at him and agreed that he was totally dry. White t-shirt and jeans. It would have been easy to tell if any of it was wet. We then say goodbye, and he starts to walk back the way that he came. Started calling for the dog to follow him, saying, Toby, come on, boy." The dog had almost no reaction to these remarks. Granted, we had food, but you would expect some kind of reaction. Then I looked closer at the dog, and it was wearing a Barbie pink collar and had metal ring hanging, but no dog tag attached to it. The man kept walking away and called the dog a few more times. Eventually, he disappeared down the trail. The dog stayed a few more minutes and then just walked away in the opposite direction they came from. Just walked off into the woods. So once they both are gone, we start talking to each other. No one saw any hikers behind us all day. No one saw any tents or shelters set up close by. We all confirmed on our map that the closest road was miles away. We all agreed that he was dry and very strange. And we all agreed that the dog seemed to have nothing to do with him, and it had a girl collar, and didn't react to the name Toby. We even tried to call it Toby and it didn't react. So, as our minds race, we decide that this man must be some kind of serial killer hiding out on the trail, living off the hikers that he kills. Killed one with a dog and decided to keep it. From there, we formulate a plan. Andy had some paracord, and we all had tin cans left from dinner. We set up a perimeter of these noise traps around the shelter and across the front opening. We also took the wooden picnic table that was next to the shelter and tipped it up on its side against the front to try and secure us inside. Nighttime, and it's absolutely pitch black. Fire pit got too wet to keep something going. We all sleep on the top bunks with our knives ready to go right by our beds. None of us really slept. At the slightest noise, we would jump, and then call each other's names to make sure that we were all there. I would pass out occasionally and fire off one of my grizzly bear snores and freak everyone else out. At one point, Kurt got down to look out the front and almost got stabbed by Andy as he was trying to climb back in his bunk. Then later, poor Morgan had to pee and was trying to pee out the front and accidentally hit the string and made the cans rattle. Well, the rest of us were ready to pounce on this silhouette by the front door, and he had to yell, "No, it's just me, it's just me." Otherwise, he would have been a goner. Eventually, we made it through the night. Sun starts to come up, and we start taking down the table and traps. We left a note in the shelter sign-in book about Toby and the man that was with him. We diverted our path and moved over near a campground the next night, set up a concealed camp quarter-mile off the trail. Then, the final morning, we got to the campground payphones and called in for our extraction. None of us have ever forgotten how terrifying that night was, and since then, we often recall the story of Toby and the man that was with him. I'm a little late to the party, and it's hiking instead of camping, but it still fits the theme. I'm walking along Striding Edge at Helvellyn in the British Lake District. It's a quite sharp glacial arête, which involves some scrambling. It's considered a technical grade 1, suitable for beginners. I'm with a mate and it's mid-afternoon. One hazard is that fog descends on the area very, very rapidly. One minute you have a low cloud and overcast skies. The next you can't see 10 yards in any direction. So it's 10 a.m., and two of us are making our first graded hike. There's a pub on the other end. We expect to make it for at latest 3. We pass other hikers on the way, exchange pleasantries, and go on our way. It's 10 past 2 when we reach the pub and we both order pie and a pint. The barkeep asks us if we've just done Striding Edge, and we confirm we have. He then asks if we saw a blonde woman, about 35 or so, with a bright red rucksack. We confirm we have. We spent 5 minutes with her talking about weather conditions on the day. At around 11:30, we climbed above the dew point and into dense fog. We told her about it because we descended beyond it by the time we saw her. As best the coroner knew, we were the last to see her alive. She'd lost footing on a particularly narrow part of the route and tumbled over 100 feet. It's a little chilling, knowing that you were the last friendly face that someone saw before their death. My boss and his dog, colleague, and I went on this hunting/camping trip in the California desert some years ago. We all had firearms, and the plan was to do a survival camping experience where we would only carry water and food for the dog, and some emergency food and communication sets. We set up camp very deep inside the desert, and the nearest town was probably an hour's drive away on our 4x4 rental truck. 2 days in and we haven't caught anything, and the heat is driving us crazy. On the second evening, as we're out on the hunt, we see what looks like mountain lion droppings around our camp. No big deal. We've got firearms and stuff on us. We return to base empty-handed on the third evening too, and we haven't eaten solid food in 3 days and are just surviving on water. We start a campfire and put our heads down for some rest, and my friend sees 2 sets of eyes staring at us in the distance. We bring the dog, and the dog goes crazy looking in the same direction as the eyes. We scramble into the tents and bring out our rifles and wait for something to happen. This standoff lasts for about 10 minutes, and we notice the animals move around a bit as we watch it. We don't fire our rifles because killing what looks like a mountain lion would invite a ton of trouble, so we just wait. At some point during this, the animals just turned around and left. I've never been more scared in my life. We packed up all of our stuff with one guy standing guard with a loaded gun at all times. We locked the doors of the car, rolled up our windows, and just left. Until today, we're convinced that it was a mountain lion. Occasionally, we think it was because we were crazed by the heat and hunger. But then, why did the dog bark? We don't know.
I recently went winter camping at a nearby state park. Had a good hike, found my campsite, and settled in for the night. The campsite was near a park road, only about 200 yards from the road, but on the other side of some trees. My tent wasn't visible from the road, which will be important later. Just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I hear footsteps coming down the trail toward my site, and when I open my eyes, I can see a beam of light scanning the woods on the other side of the pond I'm camped by. Then the light sweeps toward me, hits my tent, and turns off. Footsteps retreat. I'm a little spooked, and by now I'm definitely making sure my knife is handy, but figure it was maybe another hiker looking for a place to camp, who saw me and turned off the light once he realized someone was already in the site. Either that, or it was the rangers checking on me. I'd filed an itinerary with them. So then I finally do drift off to sleep, only to be awoken about 30 minutes later by a vehicle coming down the trail toward my tent. I can hear it crunching on the gravel trail, steadily growing louder as it gets closer. Again, I see lights sweeping the woods across the pond, this time headlights, and again they come around the bend in the trail, shining directly onto my tent. At this point, I'm spooked. Knife in hand, I call out, "Hello?" When I do, the vehicle backs up, turns around, and retreats back up the trail. At this point, I'm really spooked. I call the park office and have service, thankfully. No answer. So I call 911. I tell them where I'm at, and she tells me to hold on, puts me on hold. When she comes back, she tells me that officers are in the area, looking for someone. I ask if she can give me any more idea about what the problem is, so I can help. I'm an experienced backpacker and my day job is 911 operator, but she won't tell me anything. I tell her I'm a dispatcher, and if it's a missing hiker or suspect, I'll keep an eye out if she gives me the description, but she still won't tell me anything, so we disconnect. No idea who they were looking for, but I'm pretty sure it had to have been a suspect. It was the middle of winter, and I only saw one other person in the park all day, an old man walking his dog, close to the trailhead where I started. Between the cold and the incident, it was definitely my second worst night out backpacking. So I was around 19 camping with my buddy up in the mountains of North Carolina. We had hiked a few miles up a mountain from a campsite his grandparents were staying in, and made a little lean-to shelter off a big rock we found near a stream. This wasn't on any trail, we walked up through the stream. Everything was awesome, no worries at all. Flash forward to a little after midnight. It's really dark. Light can barely make out your hand looking up at the sky dark. The fire is nothing but coals, and I'm on the outside half of the lean-to looking out into the woods. Then, I see a light. Just for a moment, mind you. So naturally, I continue to watch that same spot. A few minutes later, I see it again, pretty much in the same spot. My first thought was we had somehow gotten up close to a road on our climb, and I was seeing some headlights through the trees. Well, I kept watching to confirm my suspicions, when the light did some crazy flip maneuver. So either someone had a crazy wreck, or it's actually someone with a flashlight walking around in the woods in the middle of the night. So I'm just frozen, staring off into the darkness waiting for Hillbilly Joe to murder me. And my friend is just snoring gently behind me up against the rock. After about 10 minutes with no more sightings of any lights, suddenly a light appears at my feet, out of nowhere. It was an orb, maybe the size of a golf ball. I've had people say, oh, it was just a firefly, but it was white. Like perfect light. I'm still not sure how to describe it, but it didn't seem to cast light on its surroundings. It just was light. But it went from the base of our shelter where my feet were, and moved silently in a perfectly straight line, all the way past my head, then disappeared. I am literally frozen solid now. Couldn't move if my life depended on it, and for all I knew it did. About 15 agonizingly long minutes after it scanned me, or whatever, it went back to flitting around near its original spot. but now it wasn't going off. It just stayed on all the time. At this point, my friend rolled over in his sleep and was close enough for me to bump him with my elbow, while not making any noise and keeping basically totally still. He was immediately awake and alert, thinking there could be an animal nearby. He leaned up on my back and peeked over my shoulder after I whispered, "Look in the woods." After a few seconds, I heard him whisper, "What the is that?" I'm not crazy. It wasn't a dream. We stayed watching the light dance around for a few minutes until he turned and looked up the hill from our shelter, and there were 2 more lights flitting around up there. We remained awake until the sun came up watching them. They stayed until about an hour before dawn. Once the sun was up, we passed out for a few hours and then packed our stuff and left. We still don't have an explanation for what they could have been. Spirits, ghosts, aliens, mutant fireflies. I will mention that when I finally fell asleep that morning when the sun rose, I had a dream reliving it. Except this time when the light scanned me, I sat up and said, "What are you?" At which point it went from its perfect white over to red and flew directly into my face. I woke up at that point. Whew, that was a lot to type. Anyone else have anything like that?
My cousins and I used to do a lot of camping in all seasons. One fall, we went to one of our usual places, this little ridge that made almost a bowl shape, perfect for us and our supplies. It's about a mile hike into the woods from where we parked. Well, that night, it was late, and we were all sitting around the fire, talking and smoking some weed. We can hear coyotes off in the distance. After a few minutes of hearing the coyotes sound off a few ridges away from us, we start hearing rustling from the ridge above us, and then we hear more coyotes sounding off, even closer than the first ones. The first ones sounded off again, and the rising we heard seemed intensified. They were getting excited and restless. We're all looking at each other, completely silent by this point. One of my cousins reaches behind him and grabs his gun and a big mag light. He stands up and walks to the edge of the fire's light and shines his mag light up to the ridge above us. And the eyes, all the pairs of eyes. There had to have been at least a dozen, just on that ridge. He shined the light all the way around us, and everywhere there were more eyes. In total, there had to have been 3 dozen coyotes, the biggest pack I have ever seen. My cousin fired off a few shots, hoping to scare them off, but they barely so much as flinched. It was a long night. We took turns sleeping in shifts, making sure that our fire never went out. The coyotes would come in closer, just feet outside of the firelight, and wait. It was maddening. Knowing that we were being hunted, knowing that to these animals, we were prey. Sometime before dawn, they slipped away without us noticing. My cousin said he looked up, and they were just gone. There wasn't a single set of eyes left. Easily the most terrifying thing that's happened to me while camping. This will probably get lost in the mix, but I used to live on the big island of Hawaii, where the current lava eruption is going on. My girlfriend and I at the time decided to go camping at Mackenzie State Park along the coast in the Puna district. We had planned on staying for 4 nights, but ended up only staying for 2 nights. I had heard about it being haunted before, but sort of wrote it off, and was sure not to mention this to my girlfriend. The first night, around 2 a.m., we woke up to what sounded like multiple people using a pickaxe on lava rock and groaning. This went on for what seemed like a few minutes, and then stopped. It was really weird, as there was only 2 other people at the park that night. and I was sure that they weren't using a pickaxe. We eventually fell back asleep and asked the other people the next morning if they heard it, and they had not. The second night, it was just my girlfriend and I at the park. I'm getting chicken skin right now thinking of what happened. It was around midnight when I woke up to what sounded like someone sprinting back and forth outside of our tent. Like they were sprinting back and forth at full speed. I was the only one up, and turned my light on and it stopped. It freaked me out, but eventually I fell back asleep. A couple of hours later, my girlfriend is squeezing my arm and whispering directly into my ear, "Someone is outside the tent." It sounded exactly like a couple of hours earlier of someone running back and forth. The corner of the tent closest to me was then lifted off the ground and shaken back and forth. We both started yelling, and the tent was dropped. I immediately grabbed my light and small machete and went outside. Nothing. Nobody around. Just us in the middle of the night along the coastline. My girlfriend was panicking at this point, so we literally picked up the tent with everything in it, threw it in the back of my truck, and just got out of there. After that happened, I talked to locals and said stories like this were not uncommon at all. If you look up McKenzie State Park, you'll find many different stories related to the park being haunted. We are definitely not the only ones to have heard people outside of our tent and have our tent messed with. And needless to say, we never camped there again. My best friend's parents live on this little dead-end dirt road outside of a real small town. Their house sits on a few acres of land and is mostly woods. About a half a mile down the road lives this old man who grew ginseng for a living. When I was about 16 or so, this guy named Bobby Joe went missing. He was last seen on that road where his mom dropped him off, and no one had any idea where he went. My friend and I used to walk up on those woods all the time, and there was a rumor around town that Bobby was trying to steal that old man's ginseng plants, then ran off and was hiding in the woods. So what else does a stupid teenager decide to do other than go investigate? There was a trail that we always walked on that was a good 20-minute hike from my friend's house. So we stayed on that same trail looking for any signs of someone camping out or something. All of a sudden, in the middle of the daylight, we heard a man yelling help from a distance. We just stopped and stared at each other and froze. We heard it over and over again, and could still hear it from the distance, even as we were running back to his house as fast as we could. They found Bobby's body the next day, buried on that man's property. He had been shot twice, and his arm was ripped off from where his body had been removed. The old man only spent a little bit of time in jail because he hadn't told the police up front that he killed him. Definitely one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me. I was a leader of backpacking trips in upstate New York for people ages 14 through college-age individuals. Once, I was leading a group of 14-year-old boys on a bushwhack, off-trail hiking, navigating with a map and compass, from one trail set to another. While deep in the woods, we look up and see that we've all but walked into a pretty elaborate hunting shelter that had intense camouflage and well-constructed insulated walls in a semi-permanent canvas tent. We were hesitant at first, but it looked like no one was using it, so we decided to take a closer look. The inside was pretty filled with old gear, but it also had some equipment that was in pretty good repair. We left the site after marking it on our maps to alert the rangers, as camps like that are illegal in the state park where we were hiking. After the trip, we contacted the ranger's office, and they said they'd be out in the next few days to destroy it. Well, my friend and I knew there as a decent bit of good gear to salvage. So on our day off, we decided to hike back in and see if we could get any of the gear before it was taken by the rangers. We hiked back, following our old bearing in reverse, and found the shelter no problem. The only issue was when we got there, all the newer gear was gone. There were even rings in the dust where the camping stove had been. We turned to leave, and there was the largest buck that I have ever seen in my entire life. 9 or so points, standing, blocking our way back. The buck saw us and kind of puffs his chest out. We stood calm and tall, facing the buck for about 3 to 5 minutes that felt like hours. It starts to dip his head and make threatening sounds. So we decided to pick up some nearby sticks and wave them around, yelling, in hopes that it scares this guy away. Eventually, the buck grunted and walked away very slowly, with his chest still puffed out. The relief was wonderful. Admittedly, this didn't happen during a camping trip, but I do camp a fair bit as well. I was in Yosemite with my dad, doing a pretty strenuous 5 to 6-ish mile hike loop, up to some waterfalls while staying in a cabin within the park. So, kind of like diet camping. Maybe halfway up the cliff/mountain/ridge, we hear this weird raspy chirping and meowing noise. Definitely a baby animal. It sounded very close, maybe a dozen or so yards away. We could hear it over the fairly loud gurgling of a nearby creek. My dad and I froze and looked at each other. Literally, 2 hours before, we saw a mountain lion, warning, and were joking about my dad fighting one off with his hiking stick. Now it was less funny because it was a distinct possibility. We walked the next mile or two with me walking backwards behind my dad, so we couldn't get ambushed in case the mother was around. We couldn't relax the rest of the hike, even though the waterfall ended up being spectacular. We get back to our cabin and look up baby cougar cries on YouTube. And yeah, that's exactly what we heard. I'm not sure how defensive those cats are of their young, but knowing there was absolutely a mountain lion within 6 miles of us that may want to eat us, or would see us as a threat against its cubs, no thanks. I'll never forget the cold fear that I felt when I first heard those meows, even though realistically, we weren't in much immediate danger. I've had a few of what could be considered paranormal experiences in my life, but this was the most recent and unnerving. I'm an avid outdoorsman and love to hunt and camp around Francis Marion and Sumter National Forest. Back in 2018, I took my young son and dog out to a remote area in the National Forest to test out a new camper shell on my recently purchased truck. We found a secluded area off of a dirt road, made dinner, and then packed it in for the night as soon as it got dark. At around 11 p.m. at night, I sat up and looked out the back of the truck due to my dog growling. In the distance, I saw what looked like hundreds of small white balls of light darting around, then hovering for a few seconds and slowly converging to our campsite. They looked just like the dust orbs that you see on videos, but these were producing light in a completely dark forest. They soon surrounded my truck. Seemed like hundreds of them. They were a soft white light, and they didn't blink. Lightning bugs were out early evening, but those were yellow and blinking. After 30 minutes of them floating around and concentrating to us, I finally worked up the nerve to open the truck and lit a lantern, and they promptly disappeared. After turning off the lights and locking back up, they came back. My son was fast asleep, thank goodness. I watched them until I finally fell asleep around 1 a.m. The next morning, when we tried to leave, the battery was dead on the new truck. There wasn't any lights in the back cab where we would have used any power. A week later, I had to replace the electric control module. Not sure if that was relevant info, but I thought I would add it. Has anyone had a similar experience? Just thinking about them again makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Get a good night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Bye-bye now.